Sweden are not a nuclear power. And in the 1950s and 60s, Sweden had this discussion about becoming a nuclear power.
Oh,
And
wow.
also experimented with a nuclear bomb of its own.
Professor Zander, Sweden has a rich history of exploration and adventurism. What I'm wondering is, did Sweden possess colonies like other European powers? And I want to distinguish that. In an earlier segment, you mentioned they possessed a Caribbean island that they had taken from France, and they had a port in West Africa. But we don't hear about Sweden in the colonial conversation the way, let's say, we hear about the Dutch, Norway, even, obviously France and Britain as well.
And that's correct. And also, they didn't take this Saint Bartholomew from the French. They just could get it in the trading. It was we can take this island, no problem. And then they sold it again. So the Swedes, but Sweden hasn't a colonial history as many other countries. But that has also perhaps been kind of a history that has been too much downplayed, because we still have it. And I think it was no later than last year that the first book on Saint Bartholomew that actually dug into that there was slaves and were slaves, and they were kind of ill-treated. And this is something that we haven't really discussed, but it has come up also in Swedish history nowadays. And it's similar like Danish history, and the Danes had more of a colonial history, but it had also taken them very long time to begin to discuss. And I would say it's more like Black Lives Matter and those kind of recent events that has turned the searchlight to this kind of dark history, if I may say so.
Well, that's a positive thing to have a level of introspection and look at your own history. You said we still have it. Does Sweden have colonies or sort of abroad possessions still to this day? No, yeah.
No.
Okay.
So I say it's nothing nowadays.
What is the reason that the Swedish governments didn't colonize other countries? I know Finland was effectively a colony. What about other places? Did Sweden just didn't have the manpower?
Yeah, I would say that, and in a way, it's because of an adventure in America that just lasted for some 10 years. For Sweden had a colony called New Delaware, and it was taken by the Dutch after a few times, and they wanted this to be so much more than it became. So it's more like after this, you couldn't say it wasn't anything but a failure. So you didn't think that this was a good thing. So and Sweden during this time isn't a very rich country. You could say that the time we talked about before, the Great Power Era, that was a time when the Swedish average income more than doubled. But after that time, after 1720, and for more than 100 years, you had so much lower financial status in Sweden. So it's kind of a poor country that has a hard time to compete. And sometimes politicians and militaries try to relive this great power era, but it always ends, with a few exceptions, in losing wars and losing territory. Finland, for instance, and also territories in the northern of Germany. So it's more like Sweden is losing territory than it's gaining colonies.
Interesting. Just a point of clarification for myself. When you say they tried for 10 years, a colony, an adventure in America, New Delaware. Is that the Delaware state that we have today in the U.S.?
Yes.
Oh, that's fascinating. You mentioned wars and, subsequent Swedish kings and politicians wanted to relive the glory of the Swedish Empire, and they lost battles. I think I'm going to ask you a question that I think we sort of discussed in the past, in the prior segment, but let's revisit it because I want a more sort of a cogent answer to it. And that's this. When I was preparing for this conversation, I stumbled across something really fascinating, that Sweden hasn't been in a war in a very, very long time, longer than Switzerland. Um, how did this happen?
Well, I would say it's a combination of good diplomacy and luck, and a great deal of luck. And you could say that Swedish politicians and especially social democrats have looked back on Swedish history and said that, well, neutrality is something that Swedish politicians and royalties choose. They choose this politics in the early 19th century. But that is not entirely true, because we have, for instance, the Crimean War, and then Sweden is prepared to take part in this war. But it
That's in
will
the
end.
1850s, where
Exactly.
France, Turkey, and Britain go against Russia, right?
Exactly. And that war also spread to the Nordic countries. For instance, Russia, who had taken over Finland, they had a base on Åland that is part of Finland, but it's also quite close to Sweden. And the Brits, they are bombarding the Russian fortifications. So Sweden is very close to this conflict, and some are also prepared to take part in this battle. But it ends, as I said. But then in 1864, the Swedish king promised the Danish king that if the Prussians and the Austrians are to attack Denmark, the Swedish army will help the Danish army.
Oh, an alliance, I see.
But Swedish politicians, and most of all Swedish generals, saying, no, 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 this will not take place, because our army is in too much of bad shape. So you may promise your Danish colleague this, but we will do it. So this is another
interesting
occasion that Sweden was almost being part of a war. And also, as I said before, both during the First World War and to a lesser extent during the Second World War, some Swedes want the nation to be a part of the war. So and also during the Cold War, it's also, a very, very tough situation. You have to balance between the US-led bloc and the Soviet-led bloc, and Sweden is in between. And there was a lot of incidents that could have turned into something else than it did. So,
yeah, because
it is marvelous that we had this long period of peace, but it could have been broken for so many times.
From the year 1814 to now, Sweden hasn't had a war, and contemporary, based on what you're sharing with me, contemporary Swedish politicians claim that this is because of our decision of neutrality, which you're debunking, saying that's not entirely true. It's a combination of just good luck and diplomacy. Which brings me to this point: why now? Why go to NATO now? They endured the Cold War, which was really perilous. USSR was just next door. So why go to NATO now?
That's a good question. And actually, a Czech journalist asked me the same thing, but she asked me before the war between Russia and Ukraine began. And at that time, the discussion was very different and was more like it has been for so many decades. And then you had seen that there's been a lot of, most political parties has said that it's good that Sweden is neutral. But some more to the right has sometimes said, well, NATO is perhaps not that bad an option. And also, some social democratic leaders had, but they didn't tell the public, but they had long-going discussions with American politicians, with NATO. So Sweden would have taken part on the Western alliance side if there was a Third World War. And this became also known during the 1990s and was kind of an upsetting debate. But then it came back to, we should stay neutral. We should also, and one important reason is that if we do so, Sweden are not a nuclear power. And in the 1950s and 60s, Sweden had this discussion about becoming a nuclear power.
Oh, wow.
And also experimented with a nuclear bomb of its own. But in the end, they found out that this could, at its best, become like a Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb. And this is at a time when the American and Soviet nuclear bombs are so much more efficient and powerful. So it's no use. So they just turned this idea down. And then it's February last year, and then it's turning very fast because you find that the situation is so much different, because Russia is shown and Putin has shown his intentions. He's no longer just talking about being an aggressor, he's becoming one. And then both Finland and Sweden thinks that, well, we are also neighboring Russia. So why should we try to have this position in between? Because it would be, for so many states, much better if we are also part of NATO.
Yeah.
So that is the reason how it began. And then it's another discussion that Finland now is a member of NATO, but Sweden is still waiting. But that has a lot to do with Turkish domestic politics and, to a certain extent, Hungarian domestic politics, and also Swedish domestic politics.
Yeah. Hopefully, that alliance, NATO, will never have to exercise its terms. Hopefully, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia would somehow subside. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Professor Zander as we get into the perspective. That is fascinating.